So let's start. History remembers the explorers who made it back. But what about the ones who didn't? The expedition so brutal, so catastrophically ill-fated, that even the history books quietly looked away. These are those stories. Number 7. The Lee Smith Arctic Expedition of 1881. Most people have heard of Shackleton. Fewer have heard of Benjamin Lee Smith, a British explorer who, by 1881, had already survived multiple Arctic voyages and was considered one of the most experienced polar navigators alive. He commanded a steam-powered yacht called the Ira, and in August of that year, he pushed deeper into Franz Josef Land than almost any human being had gone before. And the Arctic, as it tends to do, responded with absolute indifference. The Ira became trapped in pack ice off Cape Flora. Within hours, the pressure from the ice crushed the hull. The ship sank in minutes. Lee Smith and his crew of 25 men were left standing on the ice shelf with almost nothing. No rescue ship, no radio, no way to call for help. What they had was determination and a shocking amount of practical ingenuity. Over the following winter, the crew built 4 small boats from the wreckage of the Ira they had managed to salvage. They hunted polar bears and walruses for food. They burned blubber for heat. For 8 months, in temperatures that regularly dropped below -30°C, 25 men lived in improvised stone shelters on one of the most remote islands on the planet. And then, in August 1882, they launched their 4 small wooden boats into the open sea and rowed south. They were eventually rescued near Novaya Zemlya after rowing over 300 miles through the Arctic Ocean. Every single man survived, and almost nobody talks about it. Why? Partly because Lee Smith was a private man who despised publicity. He gave few interviews. He published no memoir. He quietly returned to his estate and continued living his life. The story never found a great narrator, and so it drifted out of popular memory. But make no mistake, what this crew endured rivals anything Shackleton's men experienced, and it happened nearly 30 years earlier. Number 6. The De Long Arctic Expedition of 1879. If Lee Smith's story ended in unlikely triumph, George Washington De Long's ended in almost unimaginable tragedy. De Long was an American naval officer who became convinced, based on popular but incorrect scientific theory of the time, that there existed a warm, open sea at the North Pole. He set sail from San Francisco in July 1879 aboard the USS Jeannette, with a crew of 33 men, intending to reach the North Pole via the Bering Strait. Within 2 months, the Jeannette was frozen solid in the East Siberian Sea. It would remain locked in ice for nearly 2 years, drifting helplessly westward while the crew slowly exhausted their supplies, their mental stability, and their hope. In June 1881, almost exactly as Lee Smith was preparing for his own doomed voyage, the ice finally crushed the Jeannette just as it had crushed the Ira. The ship sank in less than 2 days. De Long and his crew took to 3 small lifeboats and attempted to navigate through hundreds of miles of open sea toward the Siberian coast. 1 boat was lost in a storm, 11 men, gone instantly, never found. De Long's boat and a second vessel were separated. The second boat, commanded by Chief Engineer George Melville, made landfall successfully. De Long's boat landed on a remote section of the Lena River Delta in northern Siberia, one of the most barren, inhospitable environments on Earth. Melville's search party eventually found their camp months later. They found journals. They found a last entry, dated October 30, 1881, describing the men eating boot leather to survive. They found the frozen bodies of De Long and most of his men. Only 13 of the original 33 survived the expedition. De Long's story is taught in some naval history courses, but it has never entered public consciousness the way it deserves to. Perhaps because it ended in defeat. History has a bias toward survivors. Number 5. The La Condamine Geodesic Expedition, 1735. In 1735, the French Academy of Sciences sent a team of scientists into the jungles of what is now Ecuador, then part of the Spanish colonial viceroyalty of Peru, to answer one of the most pressing scientific questions of the era: what is the actual shape of the Earth? Isaac Newton had proposed that the planet was slightly flattened at the poles, like an orange. Other French scientists insisted it was elongated, like an egg. To settle the debate, 2 expeditions were dispatched simultaneously, one to the Arctic Circle, one to the equator near Quito. The Arctic team finished in about a year and came home. The equatorial team, led by Charles Marie de La Condamine, spent nearly 10 years in the Andes and Amazon. 10 years. What was supposed to be a focused scientific mission became one of the longest, most catastrophic fieldwork disasters in scientific history. The team was plagued from the beginning. Spanish colonial officials obstructed their work for months, demanding paperwork, permissions, and bribes. 2 members of the expedition were killed, one by a mob during a public altercation, one in a duel. Another went insane and had to be sent home. A surgeon on the team abandoned the expedition and married a local woman, later fleeing into the jungle to escape prosecution. The instruments they'd brought from Paris were damaged by humidity. The mountains they needed to survey were frequently covered in clouds for weeks at a time. And yet, La Condamine and his surviving colleagues completed their measurements. They confirmed Newton's theory. The Earth is flattened at the poles. On his return journey, La Condamine chose not to sail back to France, but instead became the first scientist to travel the length of the Amazon River, documenting rubber trees, curare poison, and platinum along the way. This expedition directly reshaped our understanding of the planet's geometry and produced 3 separate scientific legacies. It is almost completely unknown outside academic circles. Number 4. The Muniz Expedition into the Atacama, 1830s. The Atacama Desert is the driest nonpolar desert on Earth. In some areas, no measurable rainfall has been recorded in recorded human history. In the 1830s, a series of small exploratory expeditions attempted to map the interior of the Atacama for the newly independent nations of Chile, Bolivia, and Peru, who were in the process of figuring out exactly where their borders were and what resources those borders contained. These expeditions, mostly unnamed in standard histories, led by military officers and contract surveyors, face conditions that are difficult to describe. Temperatures swinging from over 40 degrees Celsius by day to below freezing at night. No surface water for stretches of over 100 miles. Mule teams dying within days of entering the interior. Men hallucinating from dehydration while trying to maintain accurate survey measurements. What made these expeditions particularly brutal was the purpose. They weren't exploring for glory or for science in the grand sense. They were doing bureaucratic work, mapping borders, documenting mineral deposits. The men who did this work received no medals, no book deals, no public recognition. They did it because it was their job. Several of them died doing it. The maps they produced became the legal foundation for border disputes and mining claims that would define South American politics for the next century, including the War of the Pacific in 1879, a conflict over the nitrate-rich territories they had mapped. These nameless surveyors produced the legal architecture of a war, and history has never once named them. Number 3. The La Perouse Expedition, 1785. In August 1785, King Louis XVI of France dispatched 2 ships, the Boussole and the Astrolabe, under the command of Jean-François de Galaup, Comte de La Perouse, with an extraordinarily ambitious mission to circumnavigate the globe, explore the Pacific more thoroughly than Cook had, and bring back scientific, geographical, and diplomatic intelligence for the French crown. It was arguably the most scientifically comprehensive expedition of the 18th century, and it vanished almost without trace. For the first 3 years, everything went remarkably well. Lapérouse explored the coasts of Alaska, California, Hawaii, Japan, Kamchatka, and the Korean Peninsula. He made contact with dozens of indigenous peoples. He sent detailed reports, maps, and specimens back to Paris whenever he found a port. His letters described a careful, methodical commander deeply concerned with the welfare of both his crew and the peoples he encountered. He was known for being unusually respectful by 18th-century European standards. In January 1788, the two ships stopped at Botany Bay in Australia, arriving just days after the first fleet had established the British penal colony that would become Sydney. Lapérouse was able to send one final dispatch back to France with the British. It contained reports, charts, and a note indicating he intended to continue south and west through the Pacific. And then, nothing. Both ships, all 223 men, simply disappeared. For 40 years, France didn't know what had happened. An expedition was sent to search for Lapérouse in 1791. It also went missing, though its crew eventually survived and returned through extraordinary circumstances of their own. It wasn't until 1826 that Irish navigator Peter Dillon found wreckage and local accounts near the island of Vanikoro in the Solomon Islands suggesting both ships had wrecked in a cyclone, with some survivors living on the island for years before dying or disappearing. The tragedy of Lapérouse is not just the death of 223 men. It is the loss of what was almost certainly the most detailed set of Pacific observations ever compiled to that point. Years of scientific data, charts, diplomatic notes, natural history specimens, all sitting at the bottom of the Coral Sea. The French scientific community mourned not just the men, but the knowledge. Louis XVI himself reportedly asked, on his way to the guillotine in 1793, whether there was any word of Lapérouse. There wasn't. Number 2. The Narvaez Expedition, 1527. Of all the expeditions on this list, the Narvaez expedition may be the most purely catastrophic in terms of scale of failure versus initial ambition. In June 1527, Pánfilo de Narvaez set out from Spain with 5 ships and approximately 600 men, with a royal commission to explore and colonize the entire Gulf Coast of North America, essentially everything from Florida to Mexico. The expedition began falling apart before it even reached the New World. 2 ships were lost in a hurricane near Cuba. Narvaez, ignoring the advice of his navigator, decided to land the entire expedition on the coast of Florida near present-day Tampa Bay and march overland, while the ships followed by sea. The ships waited, and then left, never having made contact again. The overland march through Florida was an unrelenting disaster. The 600 men were reduced to fighting Appalachian warriors, who harassed them constantly, refusing to allow the Spanish any rest or supply. The promised cities of gold that local guides described turned out to be modest agricultural villages. Men began dying of fever, infected wounds, and starvation. By the time Narvaez reached the Gulf Coast somewhere near present-day Tallahassee, he had perhaps 250 men left and no ships. In an act of extraordinary desperation, they built 5 crude rafts from materials gathered in the wilderness: horsehair for rigging, horse hides for water containers, melted down armor, and stirrups for nails. They slaughtered their remaining horses for food and floated out into the Gulf of Mexico. For weeks, they drifted along the coast. Men died of thirst even as they floated on the ocean, unable to drink the salt water surrounding them. Narvaez himself was lost in a storm at sea. The rafts were scattered. Of the original 600 men, exactly 4 survived to return to Spanish civilization, including Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who spent the next 8 years walking across the entire continent from Texas to Mexico City, living among indigenous peoples, before finally reaching Spanish territory in 1536. His account, published upon his return, is one of the most remarkable survival narratives in human history, and it exists only because everything else about the Narvaez expedition was a total catastrophe. Number 1. The Orellana Pizarro Amazon Expedition, 1541. Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of Francisco Pizarro, who had conquered the Inca Empire, launched what may be the single most grueling overland and river expedition in the history of human exploration. In February 1541, he departed Quito with over 200 Spanish soldiers, roughly 4,000 indigenous porters and servants, hundreds of pigs, llamas, and hunting dogs, a massive, well-supplied column intended to find El Dorado, the legendary city of gold, and the mythical land of cinnamon, a place supposedly so rich in spices that the trees themselves were made of it. From the first week, reality dismantled every assumption. The Andes' descent into the Amazon basin was brutal, steep, wet, cold at altitude, then suddenly swelteringly hot and humid below. The indigenous porters, dressed for Andean climate, began dying almost immediately from tropical diseases and sheer exhaustion. The pigs and llamas couldn't survive the jungle conditions. The food ran out. The hunting parties sent ahead found almost nothing in the dense, tangled forest. The Amazon basin, despite its biological richness, is notoriously difficult to harvest food from if you don't know exactly what you're doing. Within months, Pizarro's force was starving. They had found no gold, no cinnamon groves, no El Dorado, only an endless, featureless green labyrinth of rivers, mud, insects, and heat. The men were eating boiled leather, roots, and in some accounts each other. Pizarro made a decision that would accidentally change history. He sent his second in command, Francisco de Orellana, ahead with a small party to find food and return. Orellana never returned. Not because he abandoned Pizarro, though Pizarro believed he had and spent the rest of his life furious about it, but because the current of the Amazon River made going back upstream physically impossible with the resources they had. Orellana and his 57 men instead became the first Europeans to travel the entire length of the Amazon River, from its headwaters in the Andes to its mouth at the Atlantic Ocean, a journey of over 6,000 kilometers through terrain no European had ever seen. Orellana's journey down the Amazon is staggering even by modern standards. His group built a second, larger boat from jungle materials while navigating hostile river tribes, waterfalls, and a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. They fought dozens of river battles with indigenous warriors. Several men were killed by arrows. They reached the Amazon's mouth in August 1542, 18 months after leaving Quito, and eventually made their way back to Spain. Meanwhile, Pizarro, who had waited months for Orellana's return before giving up, attempted to march back to Quito. He arrived with 80 men. He had started with over 200 Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous companions. He wore tattered clothes, had no shoes, and had aged, by accounts, by 20 years. The Orellana Pizarro expedition is the reason we know the Amazon River exists. It gave the Western world its first understanding of the largest river system on Earth. And it cost thousands of lives, most of them indigenous people whose names were never recorded at all, who died in service of an expedition they had no choice about joining. That's the part that history reliably forgets. Not just the danger, not just the suffering of the European explorers, but the invisible thousands who were dragged into these expeditions and consumed by them. The real danger. So why does any of this matter? Why spend 15 minutes on expeditions that history chose to forget? Because the ones history remembers are not necessarily the ones that were most important, most dangerous, or most consequential. The ones history remembers are the ones that had good storytellers, surviving narrators, or outcomes that fitted the political narratives of their time. Shackleton's expedition was a failure that became a triumph because Shackleton wrote about it brilliantly and lived in an era hungry for heroic stories. Columbus's voyage is remembered above a dozen earlier, equally significant transatlantic contacts because Spain had the printing presses and the political incentive to amplify it. The expeditions on this list were forgotten for specific, largely unfair reasons. Lee Smith disliked publicity. De Long lost. La Condamine's work was too scientific and too slow to make a dramatic story. The Atacama surveyors were doing bureaucratic work, not glory work. Lapierre vanished before he could write his own narrative. Narvaez was a catastrophe, and catastrophes embarrass empires. Pizarro and Orellana's expedition became split. Orellana got the story. Pizarro got the resentment, and the thousands of indigenous people who died got nothing at all. What these 7 stories share is the absolute, pitiless indifference of the natural world to human ambition. Every single one of these expeditions was launched by people who believed, with complete sincerity, that they had planned adequately, that their equipment was sufficient, that their route was viable. None of them were reckless idiots. Most were the most experienced explorers of their generation. And every single one of them was humbled, broken, or destroyed by conditions they could not have fully anticipated. There's something worth sitting within that. We live in an era of GPS, satellite communication, freeze-dried food, and synthetic materials that can keep a human being warm at minus 60 degrees. And yet every year expeditions still go wrong. Mountains still claim climbers. Jungles still swallow survey teams. The ocean still takes ships. The difference between the expeditions we remember and the ones we forget is not competence, not courage, not preparation. It is often simply luck, and who is left alive to tell the story afterward. These 7 expeditions happened. They cost lives, reshaped geography, changed history, and vanished from memory. They deserve to be remembered. And now, in some small way, they are. If you found these stories as fascinating as I did, hit subscribe. There are dozens more forgotten pieces of history waiting on this channel. Drop in the comments which expedition surprised you the most. I genuinely read every single one. And if you want to go deeper, the next video is right there waiting for you. Thanks for watching.